you talk to people about why terrorism is on the rise, specifically Islamic terrorism, it becomes frustrating with some of the falsehoods that are out there. One that I hear quite often is, well, if George H.W. Bush hadn't left troops in Saudi Arabia after the first Gulf War, we wouldn't be in this mess that we are now. Buck Sexton knows that's not true. He is the national security editor and writer at theblaze.com, former New York cop, former CIA. Buck, you've worked in national security for a long time.
That's correct. I was CIA and NYPD Intelligence Division.
So how does this myth about George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., starting all this Islamic terrorism, how does that take hold and stay there?
That myth is really just an iteration of a broader one, which is that somehow jihadist terrorism is a response to Western policies. This is widespread here in the academy at universities across the U.S. If you go into Middle Eastern Studies departments, you listen in on some of the lectures. A lot of the most sort of prominent Mideast scholars will tend to peddle this idea that, well, this is a response to what's been done in the past. I assume it's probably true with Canada as well, if not more so. And the reality is that the jihadist mindset has been in place not for decades, but for centuries. And you could even stretch as far back in just the U.S. context as the Barbary Wars to the shores of Tripoli from our Marine hymn. That was the first instance of the U.S. engaging in a foreign war abroad, and it was against Islamists who believed that they had the divine right to enslave and murder Christians just because of Quranic injunction. So this is something that's by no means new, and it's very important as we fight against this ideology to understand its roots. They are textual, they are long-standing, and a lot of folks out there who have been trying to say otherwise just ignore the reality of the past few decades, the past few centuries.
All right, let's go back just to the past few decades, the roots of the Muslim Brotherhood, because this past year we've been, I guess past 2 years, we've been talking an awful lot about the Muslim Brotherhood, their rise to power in Egypt, their influence throughout the Middle Eastern region. What role does the Muslim Brotherhood play in fueling the jihad, and where did they get their start?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood's ideological founder, Hassan al-Banna, comes out of sort of a really post-colonial era. And this was a time when a lot of states that had been under the control of other powers in the past, including Western powers, all of a sudden now had to come up with some sort of an ideology for the future to move forward. And you had this hardened Islamist, political Islam sensibility that came to the forefront. But it was Sayyid Qutb who decided that this actually meant there had to be revolution. Qutb was somebody who studied Marx. He was himself a teacher. He was familiar with the sort of radical socialist writings of those who came before him, and he believed in Islamist revolution through violence. He believed in the overthrow of the existing regime. That's where the Muslim Brotherhood comes in. Now, once the Brotherhood started, of course, they wanted to be an open political party, and they had a bit of footsie with even Nasser at one period in time when they wanted to get rid of the king in Egypt. But then, of course, they realized that Islamism, and these new orders that had come to be in the Middle East were not compatible. And you had the suppression of the Brotherhood, which only recently, as we saw with Egypt, has become now in a state of flux, if you will. Where is the Brotherhood going in the future? But the Brotherhood wears many hats. It's a transnational, international organization with chapters really all over the world. So it's hard to pin down exactly which flavor and version of the Brotherhood we're talking about.
Okay, well, when I see organizations like the Muslim Students Associations that say right on their websites, we proudly follow the Muslim Brotherhood, and these students' associations are across Canada and the United States, do I need to be worried?
Well, do you need to be worried? I think you need to argue with them. I think that they're wrong. I think that also you get a semblance of people on campus in particular like to be self-styled revolutionaries of one kind or another. On my campus here in the U.S., they were avowed Marxists. There were people who believed in perhaps even the overthrow of a capitalist regime for a more just and fair society. Are they serious about it? Well, in some contexts, probably they are. I think the same logic could be applied to some of the students that are saying they would adhere to a Muslim Brotherhood ideology. Some of them, it's just to get a rise out of people, but there are those who go over to fight jihad. The Muslim Student Association, in some cases, has been a stepping stone towards radicalization. So it's on a scale, and it's a sliding scale. The Muslim Brotherhood, though, does operate as an open political party in some countries. They don't call themselves necessarily the Brotherhood, but that's really what they are.
Well, that's what
Jordan,
we saw
for example, the Muslim Brotherhood exists.
And we saw that in Egypt.
Well,
they didn't call themselves the Brotherhood. They called themselves something else, but it's essentially the same.
Oh, that's the same is true of the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, and the same is true of the Muslim Brotherhood in a number of countries. Actually, the place where they've been, among the places, I should say, where they've been the most suppressed is Syria, and we're seeing now the end result of decades of Muslim Brotherhood suppression. The Brotherhood fought against Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez, and that's where you got the well-known Hama massacre, I believe it was 1981. Yeah. That never went away. Those Islamist tendencies now have just come to the fore with all-out jihad. So the Brotherhood's a very important part of this, but they're not the only one, of course. There's Hezbollah, there's Hamas, which is an offshoot of the Brotherhood, and then there's Al-Qaeda, which takes the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. As we know, Ayman al-Zawahiri, currently the #1 of Al-Qaeda, is a former Muslim Brotherhood guy. This is where his sort of formative years intellectually were Muslim Brotherhood. So there's connections, but again, different flavors of crazy, if you will.
That's a good way of putting it. Let's pull back to the beginning then, and in this myth that George H.W. Bush or just the Western world and what we've done. Your answer then is that's not the case. This is a long-standing, ongoing process, not something started just after the Gulf War with American troops on Saudi soil.
Well, I've had this debate and argument publicly with many folks here in the U.S. and on air. All I have to do is point to, again, recent history. I don't have to go back to the Barbary Wars necessarily, or before that to the Islamic conquest of what was the Byzantine Empire, a Christian Eastern Orthodox empire at the time, by the sword, mind you. This is never really talked about in history books, or at least not taught here in schools. But if you're looking at, how we got to where we are now, you have to look no further than, for example, the Islamist desire to eradicate polytheists, the war against Hindus, the fights over Kashmir, the fights against non-believers. It's not merely against the West that the jihadists have directed their ire. They're willing to engage in attacks against any non-believer. Of course, the Jews in Israel, any non-believers anywhere in the world are a fair target to them. They are people of non-belief. They are infidels, and therefore, under this extreme interpretation of Islam, they're fair game to be killed. So that obviously can't be explained by any Western action or intervention anywhere in the world. These groups have been around much longer than the U.S. could even conceive to be, could in any conceivable way be called the hegemon, the imperialist, the meddler, if you will, that some pretend we are.
All right, Buck, great talking to you as always. And if you want to follow Buck Sexton, join Team Buck, if you will, you can follow him at The Blaze and on Twitter and elsewhere.